Hilchos Kilayim Perek Shmini, the laws of forbidden mixtures, chapter 8. We continue again, another chapter on Kilei HaKerem, forbidden mixtures in the vineyard, and we're focused on the idea of creating a distance between a vineyard that's already planted, or vines that are already planted, and bringing other foreign grain or vegetables to be planted next to them, in which you have to, before you can begin planting, make a distance of either 4 amas from a vineyard or 6 tfachim from a single vine, as we learned at length yesterday. Today the Rambam continues, and he's mostly going to be focused on the concept of a trellis. We discussed the trellis a little bit 2 days ago, the idea where you can train vines over another surface, onto wood, onto lattice work. And the idea as it relates to Kilei HaKerem is that once you have a vine going over a trellis, now the entire space covered by the trellis also is treated like a vineyard, and you cannot plant grain or vegetables under it. And today we're going to explore a variety of configurations of such trellises and what the laws are concerning those situations. Halacha Aleph, Hagafanim Shagadlu Kibriyasan. If you allow vines to simply grow naturally, meaning the branches and the clusters are lying on the ground. People don't know this because today most vineyards are all propped up. All vines are forced to go on elevation. But naturally speaking, the vines are just crawling plants. Leave them to their own devices and they'll just go again, grow along the ground, as you see in this picture here on the left. There's vines, a bunch of vines on the ground. Heina nikrayin kerem. Says the Rambam fascinatingly, although we can't really fathom it, that's how everybody did it. That's what's called a vineyard. When we talk about vineyards, don't think of vineyards as standing up vines. Vineyards in halacha are rolling vines. But the second somebody makes some form of a bed or a netting, a lattice work, above the ground, so that the clusters and the vines can pull themselves or train themselves onto it, and he raises the leafy part of the vines from the ground, onto that bed, onto that netting, and drapes it over. This in halacha is called an aris. Aris, trellis. The reeds or the ropes or whatever, the wood that you used to form that bed or that netting, upon which you trained the leafy part of the vine, are called in halacha the apifyaris. As it relates to planting grains or vegetables next to a trellis, an aris, there are different laws. So we have already 2 categories. We have already from yesterday. Next to a vineyard, you got to wait 4 amas of space. Next to a single vine, you got to wait 6 tfachim of space. Now, what's the law of distance when it comes to an aris? Says the Rambam, even if you plant just 1 row, yesterday we saw a vineyard has to be 2 rows. You plant 1 row of 5 vines or more, ve'ersan al gabe koisel, and you train them over a wall, gavoya asara, b'chayetze bay, 10 tfachim tall, or something like a wall, something like this trellis over here. Or you planted these 5 vines next to a ditch, so you're actually training them downwards. And the ditch has a nice size. It's 10 tfachim deep, 4 tfachim wide. They are called, according to halacha, an aris. And you have to treat this aris situation like a regular vineyard, by distancing 4 amas away from it and only then planting, as you distance from a regular vineyard. The difference being, here you can only have 1 row and get away with it. With a regular vineyard, you're going to have 2 rows of 3 vines each, minimum 6 vines. Here you can have simply 5 vines lined up, but because they're being trained upwards or downwards, they have a different halacha, and they are treated as 1 unit as a vineyard. Where do you count? Where do you begin measuring these 4 amas? Says the Rambam, me'ikar hageder she'ersan alav, from the bottom of the fence onto which you train them. So in other words, Ketzah, what would this look like? Here's the wall, okay? Forgive my primitive artwork here. Here's the wall. The vines, the 5 vines, are 1 amma away from the wall, but they're being trained onto the wall. Meaning that the aris is being created from the vines onto the wall. You must count from the wall 4 amas and then begin to plant the grain or the vegetables. In this scenario, it will emerge that between the grain and the actual vines is 5 amas of space. Were you to come plant the wheat on this side, not the side of the wall, the side of the vines, it's regular. Distance yourself 4 amas from the base of the vines, which would be 5 amas away from the wall. And this is how you work with any trellis. Any trellis, if you're going from the direction of the wall, you got to count the 4 amas from the wall. Direction of the vines, you count from the direction of the vines. It doesn't matter if you built the wall first, then you planted the vines on which you trained them, or you just planted the vines first, then you made the wall. Once you have trained the vines onto the wall, it becomes an artist and is treated with those laws. If later on the fence that you're using to train came crashing down and got ruined, or the ditch was filled, ein kan aris, it reverts back to no longer being an artist. Since only 1 row of vines, we default back to the regular rule. 1 row of vines is not a vineyard. Each one treated like an individual vine, and you only have to make 6 tfachim of space before you can begin planting grain or vegetables. Halacha hey, aris shecharav be'emtzoi, or shecharav emtzoi. You have a trellis that came from 2 sides, and the middle became destroyed. So this is not vines, but just to get the idea, okay? You're training vines up the side of the arch and up that side of the arch. They used to be able to meet on top, but now there's no longer anything on top in the middle. But let's say on each side, each wall, there remained 5 vines. 5 vines here, 5 vines there. Zeu hanikra piske aris. This in halacha is called the remains. The remains of a aris. And the question is, do these groups of vines still carry the power of the aris? If you had 5 vines to begin with on each side, and that was the intent, so of course each one is an aris on its own. But here, because you made it one big mix, now that the middle's been destroyed, maybe the 2 sides have less power. Says the Rambam, it depends how far apart the vines are spaced. If between the 2 there are 8 and a tiny bit, a 60th of an amma, they become separate entities, and you only have to make a distance of 6 handbreadths from each row, and then you can already plant. Now, of course, you cannot never plant under the remaining part of the arch. This we had also a couple of days ago, where the Rambam said that if you're training vines onto a trellis, you cannot plant other things even under the area of the trellis where the vines haven't yet reached, because they're going to reach there. So the only question is, how far do you have to go to the right and to the left of these remaining piske artists, the remains of the artists? And the answer to that is, it depends how far they're spaced. If they're spaced less than 8 amas, they become one big unit, you have to have 4 amas of space. If they're more than 8 amas away, 8 and a 60th really, then they become judged like individual vines, and you only have to make a distance of 6 amas. If there was exactly 8 amas, we said before 8 and a 60th, what if it's exactly 8 amas? Ideally, you shouldn't plant anything there. If you did, if in the end of the day, at least you distance yourself 6 handbreadths, then you haven't made the grain or the vegetables forbidden. If there is no fence at all, in other words, if not only the middle became destroyed, but even the walls came down, now all you have to do is only distance yourself 6 tfachim. She'ein kan loy artis v'loy piske artis, because there's nothing here. No artist, no remains of an artist. The whole thing is destroyed. Chazaru bana hageder. The moment you rebuild the wall, chazar artis lim kaimai, the chazaru piske artis lim kaiman. The artist reverts back to its place, and the remains of the artist revert back to their place, and all the laws come right back into play, whatever the case might be, each case according to its individual law. Halacha zayin. Gina ketana shi mukefes geder. You have a small garden, a very small garden, surrounded by a wall. Okay, I did my best over here. Here's the wall. This is the top view. Okay, so this is the wall. The gray is the wall. You trained vines from the outside onto all of its walls. So basically, if you can think it's not really so clear in the picture. Basically, think of a square structure surrounded by a bunch of trains of vines kind of peeking over it. So the question is the middle area now inside the wall considered to be a continuation of the vineyard? Does it all become included or trapped in by the artists? And the Rambam says the following: Im yesh ba malay baitzer v'salei mikan, umalay baitzer v'salei mikan. If there's enough space from the wall for a harvester and his basket, Talmud defines that as 2 amas, 2 cubits, about 3 feet. So if you can go in from the wall, 2 amas on each side, hayil v'hi mukefes geder, since at the end of the day, although there are vines all around it, but there's a wall that's propped up there, zaydin b'soicha yirakis, in the remaining patch, you can plant vegetables. But if the space is so small that there wouldn't be enough to divide off 2 amas on each side, let's say the whole thing is only 3.5 amas of space inside, ein zaydin b'soicha, now you cannot plant anything in there. It looks like you have one big artist, one big train trellis, and vegetables are in the middle of it. Think about it, if you have a very small square structure and there's just vines all around, you look at it from the outside, it's one big vineyard. So what are you doing planting vegetables inside it? If it's bigger space, okay, bigger space, you can make a little vegetable patch. But if it's a very small space, no vegetables allowed. Halacha ches. Gefanim shehayu zruyim b'madrega gevaya. This picture I took from the art scroll in Maseches Kilayim. You have vines that are planted on a raised element of earth. Call it an embankment. Gevaya was very high. They have a trellis, they're being trained to go over this arch, and across over here, they're hanging out horizontally over the field that's on ground level. If the space here is not so tall, a person could stand over here and harvest these grapes. We treat the entirety of the area under this trellis as being a place where actual vines are planted. And then, in the field, you cannot plant grain or vegetables till you go 4 amas further than the point where the edge of the trellis ends. Because the vineyard is considered to extend all the way to here. But if standing on the ground level, you would not be able to harvest this hanging trellis unless you stood up onto a step or onto a ladder, then then of course under the trellis, under the grapes, you can't plant anything there, but only under. You won't have to wait the 4 amma distance before you begin planting your grain or vegetables. Now, even though the Rambam describes this halacha, and the Gemara does as well, as a case where the aris is higher, the same would be true if it's all on the same level. If everything was on the same level, the same difference would apply. If you could reach it without a step stool, then it's considered that the vineyard goes till here, and you have to go 4 amas away from the edge of the trellis. If you need a step stool, then you have to keep the part under the trellis forbidden, but right after the trellis ends, you can already plant. The reason that Rambam brings this out this way is because this is the easier way to understand it. That's typically the case where you would have the difference between a step stool and not, is if the vines are in a higher place to begin with. Be that as it may, that's the halacha, that a trellis can sometimes become a full vineyard if it's low enough to be accessed by the ground level. Halacha tes. This halacha, even in the Gemara, it's pretty hard to understand the case that the Gemara is trying to make. Many different commentaries have different versions of exactly what the Gemara is describing. The Rambam himself also uses some cryptic wording. I'm going to present the case as explained by Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, actually, one of the greats of the last generation. He said he wrote much commentary on this part of halacha, the agricultural part of halacha, in his book Sharei Emunah. This is how he understands the Rambam. And I'm using again the picture from the art scroll in Maseches Kilayim. Shnei ksalim hasmuchim zelazeh. You have 2 walls next to each other at a right angle, just like this. V'hagefanim netuyim bazaviyos beinehem. The vines are planted at the corners of the wall. In other words, the 2 corners closest to each other. Here you have the 5 vines of the aris, because aris is 5 vines being trained onto the wall. V'ha'aris yotzei im haksalim mitoich hakeren, such that the aris is being shaped using the 2 walls, starting from the corner, the kole, and then it ends. In other words, all you have is 2 here, the wall continues, but these 2 end here, 3 going here, and the wall continues, but the vines end here. The question is, this is a bird's eye view of the same case. You have 2 and 3, 2 and 3. The question is, what happens with this space in the middle, right here? Are they considered to be closed in by the aris or not? Says the Rambam, Marchik me'ikre hagfanim kashir. All you have to do is distance the proper amount from the base of the vines. And I'm inserting here, as the Rambam explains in the Mishnah, you have to only distance the amount of 6 tvachim, 6 handbreadths, like an individual vine. And you can plant in the place that's closed in, where there's no artist extending. Even though in the end what you're going to plant over here is really aligned in between the space where the artist is being created. Since you've distanced yourself the proper amount, you can plant even in the space between the walls, between meaning if you have the L shape, anywhere between that's being occupied, so to speak, if you would draw out a square, that's called between the walls, you can still plant there. And again, I've presented just one straightforward explanation of the Rambam. There are many others that argue on this. Some say that the Rambam himself, in his commentary to the Mishnah, drew a diagram that's different to this. But again, as I said yesterday, sometimes you offer one interpretation and the learners, the students, can learn on their own more in depth. Halacha Yud, Gefen she'Allah ha'etz shela min ha'aretz me'at. Again, keep in mind that naturally vines in those days were left to crawl on the ground. So you have a vine, this is called, in the Mishnah, it's called an arkuba shebegefen, a knee-shaped vine, which means, and I have 2 pictures here. This is a picture from the Rambam Moznaim, which I use, and then you have a picture from the Rambam Art Scroll. Both bring out the same idea, just a little bit different pictures. The vine begins by rising a little bit from the ground. The achar kach nerkam, then it bends back down, the nimshach ala aretz, and continues on the ground, crawling on the ground. The chazar ve'olah, and then ascended. Kamayar kuba, like a knee. Right? Up, down, and then up again. Whether it's an individual vine, in which case you have to distance yourself 6 tvachim, or it's part of a larger vineyard, in which case you have to distance yourself 4 amas, where does the measuring take place from? From the core base of the vine, or from the knee of the vine? Or in this picture, from here, or from here, when it begins its vertical rise up. Says the Rambam, Ein moidedin ela misoifar akuba. We only measure from the end of the knee, where the full rise begins, loy me'ikar hagefen harishain, not from the base of the original vine. That's how the Rambam rules, blanket. Makes no differences. In the Talmud differentiates between whether you can see the original core of the vine or not. And the Rambam himself writes that difference in his commentary to the Mishnah. However, as the commentaries understand the Rambam here, he says there is no difference. The difference being mentioned in the Talmud relates to a totally different part of the Mishnah being discussed there, and the Rambam mentions it in chapter 6. It's relating to layering a vine into the ground, but not when the vine simply crawls along the ground above ground. When it crawls along the ground above ground, the Rambam is of the opinion in his halachic work that the distance is only measured from the second core, the point where the knee ends and the vertical rise begins. Halacha Yod Aleph. The Rambam kind of closing up this discussion on all these distancing between vines and vegetables gives us some closing thoughts. Kvar B'Yarnu we've already explained. Sha'afo pisha marchik ben azera ben agefen kashir. Even if a person is distancing himself properly between the vines and the grains and the vegetables, tzarich lihizarer shaloi tisake chagefen al hayarak or yisake chayarak al hagefen. You must be careful that the vine never leans over the vegetables or the grains, or the vegetables shouldn't lean over the vines. Zara yarakai tvua v'tzamcha. If you planted vegetables or grains and they grew, and then you draped over it a vine, as in this picture, hakashin mutarin, the stubble, the unedible parts of the plants are permitted. The hadagan yidalik, but the grain, the kernels, have to be burnt. Let's say you did the proper thing, 4 amas of distance between the grain and the vineyard. But the roots of the vines dug under, and they are now occupying some of the space underground, some of those 4 amas between the vineyard and the grain. It has to be uprooted. If the grain's roots were coming into this space, mutter, that's allowed. All the distances, all the amounts that we say, 6 tfachim, 4 amas, when we talk about forbidden mixtures, we're talking about an amma made up of 6 handbreadths that are loosely spaced. In the Talmud and Halacha, we have 2 ammas. When we say amma, a cubit, either it's an amma made up of 5 handbreadths or an amma made up of 6. And in that itself, sometimes you have handbreadths that are tightly bunched together, or handbreadths that are more loosely spaced. Says the Rambam, when we calculate amas as it relates to Kilayim, we want to make the distance bigger. We want to be stringent. Make it further. So 4 amas are going to be, first of all, 6 handbreadth amas, plus they're going to be the handbreadths more loosely spaced. So each amma will be a little bigger. Never be too exact, too precise with the measurements of Kilayim. We only tighten measurements if it's going to lead to astringency. Here, tightening measurements leads to a leniency, because it's going to allow you to plant the grain and the vegetables next to the grapes closer. So we want to make it further, bigger space. Again, another closing thought. All the amounts that we talk about distance between the grapes and the grains and the vegetables are only talking about Israel or Syria. Syria is that area around Israel which was captured by King David, some into Lebanon, some into Syria, some into even upper there in the north, is called Syria. The laws of Kilayim Kerem apply there as well. Aval b'chutz la'aretz, but in the diaspora, you can literally plant vegetables or grain right next to a vine in the vineyard, no problem. Even though we said in chapter 5 that Kilayim Kerem rabbinically was extended to also be forbidden outside of Israel, the sages only forbade the first dimension, the basic dimension of Kilayim Kerem, as I discussed yesterday in the beginning of the chapter. Taking 2 types of vegetable seeds, or 2 types of grain seeds, or a vegetable and a grape seed, and planting it together with a grape seed. Similarly, if you told a young goy, a young Gentile, to plant for you Kilayim Kerem outside of Israel, it's permitted. Don't instruct an adult Gentile, because that could lead you to getting confused, and one time you'll instruct a Jew to do what's forbidden, so stay away from that. Children are okay. Even though it's permitted, totally permitted, to plant vegetables right next to a vineyard outside of Israel. Vegetables that are planted there are forbidden to be eaten, even outside of Israel. So long as you actually see the guy picking those vegetables and selling them. But if you're in doubt, if you didn't see the vegetables come out from their place next to the vineyard, mutter, it's actually permitted to be eaten, as we've explained in the laws of forbidden foods, where the Rambam spent a chapter on Kilayim Kerem. There he told us that the prohibition in the diaspora is only if you see the person picking them from his field. But if you didn't see it, or if you're in doubt, then you're totally fine.